Next up, we have Josh, co-founder of Kepler Wallet and Osmosis. Let's hear how Appchains enable protocol level MEV revenue capture.
Hi everyone, my name is Josh Lee. I'm the co-founder at Osmosis, and yeah, I'm gonna do a sort of a high-level overview on why I love Appchains so much. I think I'm gonna break this down into kind of two sections. The early ones, early part, maybe covering more on the general Cosmos and Osmosis thesis, and then the second part, more in depth on how we kind of use this something called the proto-rev for good MEV and better kind of protocol level like value capture. So why Appchains, right? It's like, I think it comes in different terms. Some people call it Appchains. There's, modular thesis. There's different ways, but I think in general, there's kind of key components that makes this thesis quite compelling. And from my personal perspective, definitely not saying this is the kind of ultimate truth. I think at large, there's like three high-level ideas that make the Appchain thesis extremely compelling. And scalability, customizability, and sovereignty. And the first part, right, like scalability. I know I had to include this in these slides here because obviously we're at Scaling 2023. That being said, I'm going to be honest here. I think scaling from a purely like throughput perspective is somewhat like the least interesting part of the Appchain thesis. So I'll cover the more fun part later. But so I'm not even going to talk about throughput like as the kind of pro case for Appchains. I think the more compelling perspective for Appchains specific to scaling is just the isolation of like block space supply and demand, right? Like if you're ending up sharing this one settlement layer across all different kinds of apps, what you end up is, all right, there's some NFT minting that's happening at this second. And me as a user who just wants to swap token A to token D, the effects of transactions fees increasing due to this one mint happening sort of ends up bleeding over to my personal use case, which I'm not interested in that NFT at all. But because there's this like one settlement layer, one fee logic, it just makes for a much worse user experience, maybe better in an economic sense, but just being able to kind of isolate this and being able to kind of handle this at an application by application layer, application by application basis, I think makes this extremely compelling. The second part is customizability. And I think, AJ covered this very well. And I think, there's the first come, first serve type of way of handling how transactions get processed at the blockchain layer. But there's also this like whole, like replaced by fee, or whoever pays the highest amount of gas gets to be included first. But I don't think this, idea of like transaction fee logic has to be something that all applications find compelling, that like we have to pick one specific way of processing transactions, right? Like one example is like DeFi versus gaming. It's like, all right, I want to buy this token at any price right this second because I think there's going to be 100 more people that's going to buy this random, meme coin right after me. I'm willing to pay more money, and from a protocol's perspective, you'd be dumb to not kind of take their money. So in that case, right, it does make sense that you charge more for the amount of demand that you have. But let's say you're trying to play, like an RPG game or poker, like just the fact that I'm about to make this move at poker, but because someone else, has visibility into what I'm about to do, and they get to replace or like front run my transaction, that just basically ruins the entire experience of what that game, let's say, on-chain feels like. So, I think the case for Appchains is that you basically get to leave this transaction handling logic to each application. I think that's one of the more kind of compelling cases. And then third and last, I think, is the sovereignty part. And Zaki, who's one of the kind of big contributors in Cosmos, I think mentioned this the best, where I think blockchains are ultimately an automated representation of social consensus. And I think a lot of people are realizing that like, all right, like a settlement layer only has value and meaning when there's enough people that believes that there's value. And I can't believe that like it took us 10 years to kind of get to this place, but that's true. And different types of, you know, communities or groups of stakeholders might have different opinions. And just the fact that each of these stakeholders get to decide their own rules and also have the ability to exit out of this social consensus at any time, I think is kind of one of the other kind of compelling things about Appchains. So yeah, I'm a co-founder at Osmosis, and we're basically, you know, like a three-word way to describe it is like a decentralized exchange, but also an app chain on Cosmos. So yeah, that's our website. I think we try to kind of position ourselves a little bit more fun and experimental, playful. But I think the three kind of keywords that I think we can present to our users would be, we are the largest in Cosmos in terms of the amount of volume, the amount of liquidity. You're probably going to get the, you know, best price for any Cosmos assets. And I'm personally also just really proud of the fact that we have very vibrant governance. There's been, you know, I think there's a clear separation between like token holders, as well as validators, as well as the like contributing team, and each sort of get to balance each other out. And then lastly, I think the amount of work that we've put into IBC like UX has been kind of one of my proudest things. So we've worked on a lot of different kinds of experimentation. Like I mentioned, I think abstracting the UX of IBC, and then superfluid staking, mesh security, MEV. I'll go through one by one. But first of all, IBC, right? Like I think when we launched Osmosis, IBC was already on mainnet. It was available for anyone to use, but no one ended up using it. And I think this is the part that a lot of kind of blockchain crypto builders try to end up forgetting, is the fact that, you know, we overemphasize scaling the kind of technical side of a blockchain, but we don't quite think about like, you know, is the user side of this like technology also scalable? So, you know, for our case, it's like, hey, IBC is live, no one's using it. Is there any way that we can get users who've never used or even know about IBC to kind of use IBC in the background? So we basically kind of took ideas from like centralized exchanges. I think most people who hold crypto in a wallet have used an exchange, and there's this whole mechanism of, hey, you deposit money in and then you withdraw money out. So we, you know, in the background, that's an IBC transfer, but the user doesn't have to know it. And once we did that, and there was a kind of clear reason for you to use IBC, we definitely saw a lot more of a active, you know, uptick in the amount of IBC being used. Second, you know, I can't get too deeply into this because of time constraints, but superfluid staking, TLDR is traditionally, you know, let's say, you know, our token is called Osmo, and what ends up happening is you can either choose to provide liquidity on a pool using that Osmo, or you can stake it. And there's been kind of different takes on how you handle that, where it's like, you know, traditionally the way most people think of liquid staking is, all right, you know, I'll put my, I'll use ETH as an example. So it's like, rather than using ETH, I'll just, you know, put that into Lido, get STETH, and I'll use STETH for kind of that liquidity. But from a protocol's perspective, I think that's less than optimal, because what you end up creating is, and I think there's a pretty critical problem for ETH on this side as well, where you essentially have a proof of stake system that was designed to prevent something that, you know, resembles delegated proof of stakes systems, where, you know, you don't have 7 entities controlling like 60-70% of the power to produce blocks. But, you know, when you kind of end up giving this power by design to liquid staking providers, you are essentially creating the same conclusion, just with a different mechanism. So what I think Osmosis did was like, all right, so there's a bunch of Osmos sitting in the liquidity like providing pool that's sort of, you know, it's like to handle swaps, you don't necessarily need to kind of have all of that liquid right away. So why can't we just count, right? Like virtual Osmo almost, right? For these Osmo that's being providing liquidity in a liquidity providing pool, to also be able to kind of add security to the protocol itself. So basically making modifications at the application layer to be able to kind of internalize liquid staking at the protocol level rather than kind of handing this power off to an external liquid staking provider. But yeah, so this goes into the second part, which I think is the MEV value capture. I think it's pretty inevitable that if there is value to be captured, it's going to be captured, and that's the entire premise of MEV. And the thing is, it's like, so I think that's the easy part. Like if someone can make money off of it, they will. And then second of all, I think there's the UX around MEV where the user isn't gonna query 10 different blocks and try to calculate, hey, what's the optimal slippage, and they just want token A to token B, and that's why I actually really find Anoma's like intent design really interesting, because that removes that technicality in the middle. But I think there's an UX implication around MEV. And then lastly, the inequality of privileges, and what I mean by that is I think is largely being covered by AJ as well, where users don't have the power to produce or sequence transactions, or produce blocks or sequence transactions, but the block producers do. And back to point one, and if you are able to make money out of your privilege to produce blocks and order transactions, they will. So Osmosis built something called ProtoRev, which is a module in our app chain. And there's a team called Skip who has been building that. And I think the kind of great things about that is it creates a new way for protocols to generate revenue and distribute that to stakeholders. And the way that works is we don't try to kind of sandwich our users, which would be crazy, right? If you're trying to build a decentralized exchange that sandwiches users, that's maybe not the best, way to sell your DEX to most users. So no sandwiching, just good MEV. The inclusion of this module into the app chain was done by governance. So, most people I think were pretty excited, overwhelmingly so. And ultimately, how it works is in Tendermint/Cosmos SDK, you already have like this thing called the begin block transactions and the end block transactions, where because you're an app chain, you're able to customize your logic for a transaction to always run at the top of the block or at the end of the block. And what ProtoRev does is just takes that end block transactions and automate a very simple arbitrage logic. So essentially, one-liner would be ProtoRev is just an in-protocol back-running bot. So I think how it works, it's just very simple, right? Let's say, hey, there are 10 Osmo paired whatever pools, and I buy, let's say 100 Osmo. And because I'm not interacting with every single one of these pools, there might be price discrepancies. And all ProtoRev does is it does a 3-hop calculation of, hey, are the pools in balance? Is there any way that essentially, at the protocol privilege level, temporarily print Osmo to capture this price differences and balance these pools out? And it only runs when the output is greater than the input, so you're not, gonna end up in a situation where like flash loan exploitation and things like that. And the benefits here, I think, are pretty cool. I think the first thing being like the diversification of revenue funnel. I think traditionally, protocols have only relied on the idea that the long-term value capture is a transaction fees. And I think that's great, but what ends up happening is you either need to optimize for cheap fees and a lot of demand, or just expensive, limited block space, but highly in demand. By being able to create a revenue funnel for the protocol that doesn't rely on the transaction fees, I think there's some ways in the long term where you are able to still capture value at the protocol level without taxing specifically the users who are trying to use it. And from someone who's just trying to get token B with token A, I think these people want to use that, and having a different revenue model that specifically targets traders versus stakeholders versus others, I think it's a pretty compelling case. And yeah, I think that basically. And then second is obviously just like better swap UX, right? Like when every time I make a swap, I don't have to worry about, all right, is the pool that I'm trying to interact with imbalanced? Like, should I look through these other tooling that check, it's like, hey, you should probably do this instead, et cetera, because there's an in-protocol arbitrage bot. Most users are likely going to be getting roughly the same price rather than having to do that work at the user side. Yeah, and then lastly, I think there's more power to governance. And there was a Paradigm article talking about why having protocol treasury in just your token is a bad idea, right? It's very much all eggs in one basket situation. Like you want to diversify, but we all know that like as soon as say, hey, we're just gonna diversify our treasury a little bit, everyone basically hears that as, oh, you guys are gonna sell tokens to buy this other token. But because ProtoRev captures this value, like these tokens in the process of being traded, what you end up is you kind of get a basket of tokens that are being traded on Osmosis, which slowly kind of gets added to the treasury, which I think is pretty interesting take on kind of growing a diversified community pool. Yeah, and that's the case for Appchains. Thank you.